She carried a dead man's debt and a saddlebag packed with nothing but desperation. 14 ranchers had turned Aviana Cooper away before the first snow fell. They saw a woman marked for ruin and bolted their doors against the cold. Up on Bitter Creek, a hermit who hadn't spoken 10 words in 5 years watched her drag a half-dead mule up his switchback trail. He didn't offer pity. He didn't ask her name. He just stepped aside and opened the gate. Winter came early to the Wyoming Territory that year, settling into the valley like a heavy iron lid. Aviana Cooper felt the bite of it through the thinning soles of her leather boots. She stood on the porch of the Miller Ranch, the frost already clinging to the hem of her wool skirt, watching Elias Miller stare at the floorboards. "I can't, Abby." Elias muttered, his voice barely louder than the wind rattling the porch beams. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "You know how it is. Hiram Walsh holds the paper on your father's place. He made it clear to everyone in the basin. Anyone who takes you in takes on the interest of that debt. I've got a wife, 3 girls. The winter's going to be hard enough." Aviana didn't cry. The capacity for tears had been burned out of her weeks ago, right around the time they buried her father in ground so hard the gravedigger snapped a pickaxe. "I understand, Elias," she said. Her voice was flat, hollowed out. She turned and walked down the steps. She didn't look back. There was no point. Elias was the 14th man she had asked. He was the 14th man to look at his boots, apologize to the air, and leave her to the wind. Down in the settlement, Hiram Walsh was waiting. Walsh owned the saloon, the Mercantile, and half the cattle in the territory. He operated on a simple, brutal arithmetic. Aviana owed him $400. She had no money. She had no family. Therefore, Walsh reasoned he owned her. He had offered her a room above the saloon. The implication of how she would work off the debt wasn't disguised. It was stated over a glass of rye accompanied by a heavy, calloused hand on her knee. She had slapped the glass from his hand and walked out into the freezing mud. Now there were no more doors to knock on in the valley. The sky to the north was turning a bruised, violent purple. A blizzard was coming. She walked to the edge of the Miller property where she had tied her mule Barnaby. The animal's ribs showed through its dull grey coat. It lowered its heavy head, exhaling a plume of white steam. "Just you and me, old man," she murmured, untying the frozen knot. There was only one place left to go. Up. Rising abruptly from the edge of the valley floor was the jagged spine of the Bitter Creek Range. It was a hostile stretch of granite and black timber. Only one man lived up there. Gerard Jimenez. Down in the saloons, the men told stories about Jimenez to scare off greenhorns. They said he was an outlaw from the border wars. They said he killed a pair of prospectors with a splitting maul when they tried to pan his creek. They said he hadn't spoken to a living soul in half a decade. He traded for salt and coffee twice a year, leaving pelts on the porch of the trading post and taking what he needed in the dead of night. To the men in the valley, Gerard Jimenez was a monster. To Aviana, he was the only man who wasn't afraid of Hiram Walsh. She took Barnaby's lead rope. Her fingers were stiff, the knuckles split and bleeding. She wrapped the rough hemp around her hand. "Come on," she said. They started up the trail. The incline was brutal, an immediate assault on her lungs and calves. The wind funneled down the canyon, carrying sharp needles of ice that stung her cheeks. She focused on putting one foot in front of the other. The mud turned to shale, and the shale turned to ice-slicked rock. Hours bled into one another. The temperature plummeted. Barnaby faltered twice, going to his knees on the treacherous path. Both times Aviana dropped into the snow beside him, wrapping her arms around his thick neck, hauling upward with every ounce of strength left in her underfed frame, swearing at him, pleading with him. "You don't die here," she hissed through chattering teeth. "You hear me? You don't give them the satisfaction." The sky darkened completely. The snow began to fall in heavy, blinding sheets. She couldn't feel her toes anymore. The creeping warmth of hypothermia started whispering in her mind, telling her to just sit down under a ponderosa pine. Just for a minute, just to rest. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. The pain woke her up. She kept pulling the rope. Then, through the blinding white, she smelled it. Wood smoke. Pine resin. She rounded a massive boulder, the wind shrieking in her ears, and saw a glow. A heavy timber cabin was built directly into the side of a granite cliff, sheltered from the worst of the wind. A split-rail fence surrounded a small, snow-covered yard. A man stood by the woodpile. Gerard Jimenez brought the heavy maul down, splitting a frozen round of oak in perfect halves. The crack echoed like a rifle shot over the howl of the wind. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and thick with muscle wrapped in a heavy buffalo coat. A dense, dark beard obscured the lower half of his face, dusted white with snow. He paused, resting the head of the maul on the chopping block. He looked up. Aviana stood at the edge of the tree line, swaying on her feet. She looked like a ghost blown in from the tundra. Her skirt was frozen stiff, caked with ice up to her knees. Her shawl was wrapped so tightly around her head it obscured everything but her eyes. Beside her the mule stood with its head drooping near the ground, defeated. Gerard didn't move. He didn't reach for the Winchester leaning against the porch rail. He just watched her. Aviana forced her legs to carry her forward. Every step was agony. She reached the closed gate. She let go of Barnaby's rope and gripped the top rail to keep from collapsing. She tried to speak, but her jaw was locked with the cold. She swallowed hard, forcing her throat to work. "I need—" she started. Her voice cracked, barely a whisper. She tried again, louder. "I can cook. I can mend clothes. I can skin a buck. I don't eat much." Gerard stared at her. His eyes were a pale, striking grey, catching the amber light spilling from the cabin window. They were completely unreadable. "Hiram Walsh took my father's farm." Aviana pushed on the words, tumbling out in a desperate, shivering rush. "He claims I owe him. The town won't take me. If I go back down there, he'll—" She stopped. She refused to say it out loud. "I just need a corner by the fire until the thaw. I'll work. I swear to you I'll earn my keep." The wind whipped between them, tearing her words away. She waited for the rejection. She waited for the sneer, the demand for payment, the harsh laugh. It was what she knew. It was how the world operated. You were either useful or you were prey. Gerard leaned the maul against the chopping block. He walked towards the gate. His boots crunched heavily in the snow. He stopped on the other side of the timber rail. He was terrifyingly close. She could smell the scent of raw timber leather and sweat radiating from him. He didn't look at her face. He looked down at her hands, still clutching the frozen top rail. They were blue. The skin cracked over the knuckles. He reached out. Aviana flinched, her instinct screaming, bracing for a blow or a rough grab. Gerard ignored her flinch. He unlatched the heavy iron hook holding the gate shut. He pulled it open, stepping back to leave the path clear. He didn't say a word. He walked past her, his massive frame brushing the snow from her shoulder, and took the mule's lead rope. He didn't yank it. He clicked his tongue once softly and guided the exhausted animal toward a sturdy lean-to attached to the side of the cabin. Aviana stood frozen in the open gateway. She didn't understand. There were no terms negotiated. There was no demand. Gerard secured the mule, tossed it a flake of cured alfalfa, and walked back to her. He stopped on the porch. He looked back over his shoulder at her, still standing in the snow. He tipped his head toward the open cabin door. "Get inside." The gesture was unmistakable. Aviana stumbled forward, her boots dragging on the wooden planks of the porch. She crossed the threshold. The heat hit her like a physical blow. The cabin was dominated by a massive stone hearth. A fire roared behind a wrought-iron grate. The air smelled of roasted coffee-dried sage and clean wood. It wasn't the foul, neglected den of an animal that the townspeople had described. The floorboards were swept. Cast-iron pans hung in neat rows. Books, dozens of them, were stacked on crude shelving against the far wall. Gerard stepped inside behind her and pushed the heavy door shut, dropping a thick timber bar across the iron brackets. The howling of the storm was instantly muffled. He walked to a washstand, poured warm water from a kettle into a tin basin, and dropped a clean rag beside it. Then he went to the cast-iron stove, poured a mug of black coffee, and set it on the rough-hewn table. He still hadn't spoken. He didn't look at her. He pulled off his buffalo coat, hung it on a peg, and sat down in a rocking chair by the fire, picking up a piece of harness leather and an awl. He went to work. Aviana stood by the door, dripping melting snow onto the floorboards. She looked at the warm water. She looked at the steaming coffee. Her cynical mind raced, searching for the trap. What does he want? When does he collect? She unwrapped her shawl with trembling fingers. She moved to the basin and washed the dried blood from her knuckles. The warm water stung, but it felt like salvation. She took the coffee. She sat in the chair opposite him. The silence stretched. It wasn't a heavy, oppressive silence. It was the silence of a man who simply had no use for words. Aviana wrapped both hands around the hot tin mug, the trembling in her bones slowly beginning to subside. She watched the firelight dance across Gerard's scarred hands as he worked the leather. She was in the den of the mountain monster. And for the first time in 6 months she felt safe. The next morning, Aviana woke to the sound of splitting wood. She blinked at the unfamiliar timber ceiling. She was lying on a low cot tucked into the corner of the cabin. A heavy hand-stitched quilt was tucked around her shoulders. She sat up, panic momentarily flaring in her chest before the memory of the climb and the silent mountain man settled back into her mind. Gerard was already outside. The cabin was warm. A fresh pot of coffee sat on the stove, and a covered skillet sat on the warming plate. Aviana threw off the quilt. She was still wearing her damp wool skirt and blouse. She went to a saddlebag which Gerard had brought in during the night and changed into dry clothes. She walked to the stove and lifted the lid of the skillet. Fried salt pork and potatoes. Her stomach cramped violently at the smell. She hadn't eaten a full meal in 3 days. She grabbed a tin plate, piled it high, and ate standing over the stove, barely chewing. When she finished, she washed her plate. She looked around the cabin. Her survival instincts, honed by a lifetime of hard men and harder bargains, kicked in. She had promised to earn her keep. If she didn't show her worth immediately, he might throw her back out into the snow. She found a broom made of bundled twigs and swept the floor. She gathered his mending a torn flannel shirt and a pair of wool socks with blown-out heels and sat by the fire with her needle and thread. When Gerard returned 2 hours later, stomping the snow from his boots, Aviana stood up sharply, the mending dropping to her lap. He carried a brace of snowshoe hairs over his shoulder. He stopped in the doorway, looking at the swept floor, then at the neatly folded shirt on the table, the tear flawlessly repaired. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a word of thanks. He walked to the washstand, cleaned his hands, and set the hairs on a heavy butcher block. He pulled a skinning knife from his belt and went to work. I can do that, Aviana said, stepping forward. Gerard paused. He looked at her hands, still raw and scabbed from the climb. He shook his head once, a slow, deliberate motion. He pointed the blade at the stove, then at the coffee pot. She understood. You make the coffee. I skin the meat. The first week passed in this strange, wordless rhythm. It drove Aviana half-mad with anticipation. Every night she lay awake on the cot, listening to the deep, even rhythm of Gerard's breathing from his bedroll near the hearth. She kept waiting for the floorboards to creak. She kept waiting for him to cross the room and demand the payment that every man in Oakhaven would have demanded. He never did. He rose before dawn. He checked his traplines. He chopped wood. He cleared the snow from the roof of the lean-to so it wouldn't collapse on Barnaby. Aviana cooked. She cleaned. She mended. She learned the topography of his silence. She learned that a sharp exhale meant he was frustrated with a tangled snare. She learned that a tap on the table meant the coffee was boiling over. She learned that when he sat in his chair and stared into the fire without moving, he was thinking about something far away, and it was best to leave him be. One evening, a week into her stay, the storm broke, leaving a sky so clear and cold it looked like shattered glass. Aviana was washing dishes. Gerard was greasing his boots. The tension of waiting for the other shoe to drop had built up in her chest until she couldn't breathe. She was a woman who understood ledgers, debts and payments. The math of this cabin wasn't adding up, and it terrified her. She slammed a tin cup down on the washstand. The loud clatter made Gerard look up his hand, pausing on the leather of his boot. She turned to face him, her chest heaving. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded. Her voice was sharp, brittle, breaking the silence of the cabin like a thrown rock. Gerard didn't flinch. He just watched her. "You haven't asked for anything," she said, her voice rising, tinged with a desperate anger. "You give me food. You give me a fire. You haven't touched me. You haven't spoken a word to me. What do you want, Gerard? Everyone wants something. Tell me what my bill is so I know how to pay it." Gerard looked at her flushed face, her angry, terrified eyes. He wiped the grease from his hands on a rag. He stood up slowly. He was a foot taller than her. He walked across the room. Aviana held her ground, her chin jutting out, refusing to step back, though her heart hammered against her ribs. He stopped a few feet away. He reached toward the small bookshelf against the wall. He pulled down a worn, leather-bound volume and opened it to a marked page. He handed it to her. Aviana took it confused. She looked down. It was a copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. A single passage was underlined in heavy charcoal. "Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one." Aviana stared at the words. The charcoal was slightly smudged, as if a thumb had rubbed over it 100 times. She looked up. Gerard was already walking back to his chair. He sat down, picked up his boot, and resumed greasing the leather. The anger drained out of Aviana, replaced by a sudden aching tightness in her throat. She looked around the cabin, the roaring fire, the mended shirt, the smell of roasted meat. She looked at the massive, silent man who the valley called a monster. He wasn't waiting to collect a debt. He was just a man holding the gate open in the dark. For the first time since her father died, Aviana sat down in her chair, put her face in her hands, and wept. Gerard didn't try to comfort her. He didn't tell her to stop. He just kept the fire burning so she wouldn't be cold while she fell apart. Winter ground the mountain down to its bare, frozen bones. Up on the ridge, time stopped being measured by days and shifted into a rhythm of firewood flour rations and the slow creep of shadows across the floorboards. Aviana learned to speak Gerard Jimenez's language. It was a vocabulary built entirely on heavy glances, the placement of tools, and the economy of motion. If he left his heavy wool coat draped over the back of the rocking chair rather than hung on its peg, it meant the temperature was dropping, and she needed to keep the stove banked high. If he set the coffee pot on the far left side of the cast-iron surface, it meant he was heading out to check the deep ravine traps and wouldn't be back until dusk. She healed. The brutal hollows beneath her cheekbones filled in, fueled by a steady diet of venison-dried root vegetables and hot cornmeal. The dark, exhausted bruises under her eyes faded. Her hands, previously cracked and bleeding from the freezing trek, calloused over. She stopped waiting for the cruel catch. One afternoon in late February, the sky cleared to a piercing, fragile blue. Gerard walked into the yard carrying an old, heavy-barreled Sharps rifle. He set a row of pine cones on the top rail of the fence 50 yards out. Aviana watched from the porch, wiping her wet hands on her apron. She knew her way around a shotgun her father had kept a rusty double-barrel by the door to scare off coyotes, but she had never fired a precision weapon. Gerard turned, caught her eye, and tapped the wooden stock of the Sharps. He pointed to her. She walked down the porch steps, the snow crunching loudly under her boots. He handed her the rifle. It was staggeringly heavy, the cold iron biting through her thin wool mittens. He didn't correct her stance with words. He simply stepped behind her. He tapped the back of her left knee with the toe of his boot, prompting her to widen her stance. He pressed a heavy, calloused hand against the small of her back, pushing her center of gravity forward. Then he tapped her elbow, lifting it level with her shoulder. His proximity was overwhelming. The smell of him wood smoke, pine pitch, and clean sweat was a sudden, heavy presence. Yet there was no threat in his touch. It was entirely clinical. It was the touch of a man making sure a tool was aligned correctly. She sighted down the heavy barrel. The pine cone looked impossibly small. He tapped her shoulder. Breathe. She inhaled the freezing air, let half of it out, and squeezed the heavy trigger. The roar deafened her. The recoil slammed into her shoulder like a mule kick, knocking her back a half step. Gerard's hand was instantly there, catching her shoulder blade, steadying her. She blinked through the plume of white smoke. The pine cone remained untouched. A spray of bark exploded from the tree trunk 3 feet to the left. Aviana swore under her breath, lowering the rifle. Pulled it. Gerard reached over, taking the weapon from her hands. He didn't mock her. He didn't roll his eyes. He broke the action, sliding a fresh brass cartridge into the breech. He handed it back. He tapped his own cheekbone, then pointed to the rifle's stock. Cheek welled. Tighter. She raised the rifle again. She pressed her face hard against the freezing wood. She focused on the front blade sight. She remembered the rhythm of her father's debts, the sneer on Hiram Walsh's face, the closed doors of the valley below. She funneled all that lingering hollow anger into the tiny point of focus at the end of the barrel. She fired. The middle pine cone vanished in an explosion of splinters and snow. Aviana lowered the rifle. Her shoulder ached violently, but a sharp, entirely unfamiliar feeling blossomed in her chest. Pride. She looked back at Gerard. He was watching the fence line. Slowly he nodded once. He reached out, took the rifle, and walked back toward the cabin. That night, after the fire had burned down to a dull orange glow, Aviana sat on the edge of her cot. Gerard was across the room, sharpening a skinning knife with a wet stone. The rhythmic shh of the steel against the rock was hypnotic. My father wasn't a bad man, she said softly into the semi-darkness. It was the first time she had spoken of the valley in weeks. He was just a weak one. He thought he could outsmart the weather. He thought he could outborrow a bad yield. Hiram Walsh knew he couldn't. Walsh just waited him out. The scraping of the whetstone stopped. I swore I wouldn't be weak. Aviana continued staring at her hands. But when they shut the doors, when Elias Miller looked at his boots and told me to leave, I realized you don't have to be weak to lose. You just have to be alone. She looked across the room. Gerard was sitting perfectly still, the knife resting on his knee. He was looking directly at her. In the dying light, his pale eyes caught the embers. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't tell her it would be fine. He simply stood up, walked to the iron stove, and pushed 2 heavy logs into the embers. He closed the iron door with a heavy final clang. He was making sure the fire would last through the night. He was making sure she stayed warm. It was the most profound answer anyone had ever given her. April broke the mountain's jaw. The ice fractured with sounds like cannon fire echoing down the canyons. The snowpack began to rot from the bottom up, turning the steep trail to the valley into a treacherous, churning river of black mud and broken shale. With the thaw came the dread. Aviana felt it settling back into her bones. The cabin had been a sanctuary only because it was inaccessible. The winter had built a fortress wall around them, but the sun was tearing it down. She spent her mornings on the porch, a woven shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, staring down the canyon. She couldn't see the town of Oakhaven from up here, the timber was too thick, but she knew what was happening down there. The freight wagons would be moving again. The saloons would be full. And Hiram Walsh would be looking at his ledger. Gerard noticed the shift in her. He saw the way she jumped when a dead branch snapped in the woods. He saw the way she lingered near the Winchester by the door. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just started leaving the rifle fully loaded. The first week of May, the mountain finally breathed. The green shoots of prairie grass pushed through the mud. On a Tuesday afternoon, Barnaby the mule let out a harsh, jagged bray from his corral. Aviana was inside kneading bread dough on the flour-dusted table. Her hands stopped. The blood drained from her face. She wiped her hands on her apron, her heart suddenly hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She stepped to the open door. A rider was coming up the final switchback. The horse was lathered, its chest heaving as it fought for footing in the deep mud. The man in the saddle wore a canvas duster and a flat-brimmed hat pulled low against the sun. It was Silas Hatcher. He was one of Walsh's regular enforcers, a man who smiled too much and enjoyed his work entirely too well. Aviana froze. The instinct to run to hide in the root cellar seized her, but there was nowhere to run. The mountain ended here. Gerard stepped out from the side of the cabin. He carried an axe over his shoulder, having just finished limbing a felled pine. He stopped in the center of the muddy yard. He didn't lower the axe. Hatcher pulled his exhausted horse to a halt 10 yards from the gate. He leaned forward in the saddle, resting his forearms on the pommel. He looked at Gerard, then his eyes flicked to the porch. He spotted Aviana. A slow, greasy smile spread across his face. "Well now," Hatcher called out, his voice loud and artificially cheerful, slicing through the quiet of the mountain. "I'll be damned. The boys in town laid odds you were dead in a snowbank, Miss Cooper. Or eaten by a bear. Looks like you found yourself a different kind of animal." Aviana's throat was tight. She couldn't speak. Hatcher shifted his attention back to Gerard. "You're Jimenez, the hermit. Don't believe we've formally met." Gerard stared at him. The axe remained resting easily on his broad shoulder. His stance was completely relaxed, which made him look infinitely more dangerous. "I'm here on business for Mr. Walsh." Hatcher continued his horse, sidestepping nervously in the mud. The animal could sense the suffocating tension in the yard. "Miss Cooper there has an outstanding account, $400, plus interest for the winter. Mr. Walsh is a patient man, but the snow's gone. It's time to settle up." Hatcher pulled a folded piece of heavy paper from his duster pocket. He waved it in the air. "I got the writ right here, signed by the circuit judge. She comes down with me, works off the debt at the saloon, and everything is square. You keep out of it, mountain man, and nobody gets hurt." Aviana stepped forward until she was at the very edge of the porch steps. Her hands were shaking, but she forced her voice to carry. "I'm not going back down there, Hatcher." Hatcher sighed, a dramatic, exaggerated sound. "Now, Abby, don't make this ugly. You know Hiram. You know what happens when people make him come up the mountain himself. He won't be as polite as me. He'll bring 6 men, and they'll burn this shack to the ground with both of you in it." He looked at Gerard, his tone hardening. "Send her out, Jimenez. This ain't your fight. You don't owe her nothing." Gerard finally moved. He didn't step aside. He didn't look at Aviana. He slowly lowered the axe from his shoulder. He drove the heavy iron blade deep into the chopping block with a single brutal, one-handed strike. The sound cracked like thunder. He turned his back on Hatcher. He walked up the porch steps, passing Aviana without a word. He went inside the cabin. Hatcher let out a sharp laugh. "Smart man. He knows when he's beat. Get your coat, Abby." Aviana's stomach plummeted. A cold void opened in her chest. She had thought she had hoped that the silent bond they had forged meant something. But Hatcher was right. It wasn't his fight. The world operated on self-preservation. Why would a man who lived outside the world risk his life for a woman he barely knew? She turned her shoulders, slumping in defeat, preparing to walk inside and gather her meager belongings. The heavy timber door swung open. Gerard stepped back onto the porch. He wasn't carrying her saddlebag. He was carrying the Winchester lever-action rifle. He didn't shoulder the weapon. He didn't aim it. He just held it across his chest, his large hands gripping the dark wood of the stock and the cold iron of the barrel. He walked past Aviana, stepping down into the mud of the yard. He walked until he was standing 3 feet from Hatcher's horse. The horse whinnied, tossing its head, terrified of the massive, silent man blocking its path. Hatcher's smug smile vanished. His hand hovered nervously near the revolver strapped to his hip. Gerard looked up at Hatcher. His pale grey eyes were flat, completely devoid of fear or hesitation. It was the look of a man who had killed before, and who had entirely made peace with doing it again. He raised his left arm. He pointed a thick, calloused finger down the trail. Back towards the valley. He still didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The mountain was speaking for him. Hatcher swallowed hard, the Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. The bluster evaporated. He was a bully who operated with a pack behind him. Sitting alone on a tired horse in front of a man who looked like an avalanche waiting to happen, the math suddenly changed. "Walsh ain't gonna let this go." Hatcher hissed, his voice lacking its previous volume. "He'll come back. He'll come with enough guns to leave you bleeding in the dirt." Gerard cocked the rifle. The metallic clack-clack of the lever action racking around into the chamber was the loudest sound in the canyon. Hatcher yanked the reins hard, turning the horse in a panicked circle. Mud sprayed against the fence. He spurred the animal, driving it recklessly back towards the switchback, nearly sliding off the edge of the trail in his desperate haste to get away. Gerard stood in the yard, watching the rider disappear into the timber. The sound of thrashing hooves faded into the distance. He slowly uncocked the hammer, lowering the weapon. He turned around and walked back toward the porch. Aviana was clutching the porch rail, her knuckles white. She was breathing hard, staring at him. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. "They'll kill you." She whispered the words, tearing at her throat. "He meant it, Gerard. Walsh has the money. He has the town. He'll bring an army up here." Gerard looked up at her. He looked at the flower still dusted on her cheek. He looked at the fierce, terrified life in her eyes. He reached out. His large, rough hand gently brushed the flower from her cheekbone. The touch was incredibly light, a stark contrast to the violence he had just threatened. He looked toward the valley. His jaw tightened. Let them come. Spring crept up Bitter Creek, dragging the scent of pine resin and thawing earth through the canyon. It brought no comfort. The mountain was holding its breath. Aviana watched the trail every waking hour, her eyes aching from the harsh glare of the sun on the lingering patches of snow. She was waiting for the inevitable. Gerard went to work. He moved with a terrifying mechanical efficiency. He wasn't simply a man preparing to defend a home. He was a man preparing for a war he already knew intimately. He stripped the cabin of any illusions of domesticity. He dragged heavy, unsplit logs from the woodpile, bolting them across the lower halves of the cabin windows with thick iron spikes. He pulled up a loose floorboard near the hearth, reaching deep into the dark earth below. When he stood, he hauled a heavy, wax-sealed wooden crate onto the table. He pried the lid off with a crowbar. Inside were dull grey bricks of lead-brass bullet mold and 3 large sealed tins of black powder. Aviana didn't ask questions. The time for negotiating with the world was over. She stoked the iron stove until the metal casing glowed a dull cherry red. She set a heavy iron crucible directly onto the hottest plate, dropping the lead bricks into the bowl. They melted down slowly, turning into a shifting, silvery pool that radiated a brutal heat. Gerard sat at the table. He dipped a small ladle into the crucible, pouring the molten lead into the brass mold. The sharp hiss of the hot metal, the acrid smell of sulfur, the rhythmic clack of the mold opening to drop perfect deadly spheres into a bucket of water, it became their new grim language. They worked for 2 days. They barely slept. On the third night, Gerard walked to the corner where Aviana's cot sat. He carried a canvas bandolier heavy with brass cartridges. He dropped it on the blanket. Next to it he placed a Colt single-action revolver. The bluing was worn off the barrel from years in a holster, but the cylinder was clean and oiled. Aviana stared at the gun. It was a heavy, ugly thing designed for one singular purpose. She looked up at him. "I've never shot a man, Gerard." He stood over her. The amber light from the hearth carved deep shadows into the scars around his eyes. He didn't offer a gentle reassurance. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at the revolver, then pointed at her chest. He made a sharp, pushing motion away from his body. "Keep them away." He turned and walked to the heavy oak door. He lifted the timber bar, pulling the door open to the cool night air. He stepped out onto the porch, carrying a canvas sack clinking with iron bear traps and coils of heavy wire. He was going down the trail to rig the narrowest switchbacks. Aviana sat alone in the dim cabin. She picked up the Colt. It weighed heavy in her palm, cold and absolute. For her entire life, men like Hiram Walsh had dictated the terms of her existence. They held the paper. They owned the land. They made the rules, and women like her were expected to quietly endure the consequences of their ledgers. She had run from them. She had begged them. She had nearly frozen to death trying to escape them. She thumbed the hammer of the Colt back. The metallic clicks were sharp, precise, and final. She wasn't running anymore. She walked to the table, grabbed a rag, and began wiping the excess oil from the cylinder. If the valley wanted to collect a debt, they were going to have to bleed for it. Gerard returned an hour before dawn. His boots were caked with black mud, his hands scraped and raw from hauling iron chains through the dark. He locked the heavy door, dropping the timber bar into its iron brackets. He looked at Aviana, who was sitting in the rocking chair, the loaded Colt resting on her thigh. He gave a single short nod of approval. He laid his Winchester across the table, sat down in the chair opposite her, and closed his eyes. The trap was set. Now they only had to wait for the wolves to walk into it. Thursday afternoon brought the heat, baking the mud into a hard, cracked crust. It also brought the riders. Aviana saw them first. A bruised, dirty, yellow cloud of dirt kicked up on the valley floor, turning deliberately toward the base of the Bitter Creek Trail. She stood on the porch, a heavy pair of brass binoculars pressed tight to her eyes. Her breath caught in her throat, a cold spike of adrenaline piercing her chest. "They're here," she said. Her voice was flat. No panic, just the delivery of a fact. Gerard stepped out of the cabin. He didn't ask for the glass. He simply looked down the canyon. Through the magnified lenses, Aviana counted them. 7 horses. Hiram Walsh rode at the front. He wore a dark wool suit and a bowler hat, looking absurd and arrogant against the brutal Wyoming scrub. He wasn't a man who did his own killing. He hired men for that, but his pride had been wounded. A hermit had chased off his collector. Walsh needed the town to see him bring the mountain to heel. Beside him rode Hatcher, a shotgun resting across his saddle horn. Behind them trailed 5 men. Hired guns, drifters with weathered dusters and low-slung holsters, men who would burn a cabin to the ash for a gold eagle and a bottle of rye. She lowered the binoculars. She looked at Gerard. He was already moving. He didn't take a defensive position in the cabin. He grabbed the heavy sharps rifle, the Winchester, and a canvas bag of ammunition. He walked past her, heading straight for the gate. "Where are you going?" Aviana asked, stepping after him. "The cabin is fortified." Gerard stopped. He turned back. He pointed to the cabin, then pointed to her feet. "You stay." Then he pointed down the mountain toward a narrow, jagged cut in the granite about a half-mile below. The locals called it the Devil's Throat. It was a vicious bottleneck where the trail narrowed to 6 feet wide, flanked by a sheer cliff on one side and a 200-foot drop on the other. He wasn't going to wait for them to reach his home. He was taking the fight to the mountain. Aviana watched him disappear down the trail, moving with the terrifying, silent grace of a predatory cat. She stood in the yard for exactly 10 seconds. She looked at the fortified cabin. It was safe. It was exactly what he wanted her to do. She cursed under her breath, grabbed the Winchester from the porch rail, and ran after him. The climb down was treacherous. The loose shale slid under her boots, threatening to send her pitching over the edge. She caught up to Gerard just above the Devil's Throat. He was lying flat on his stomach behind a massive outcropping of granite, the heavy barrel of the sharps resting on a folded canvas sack. He heard her boots crunching on the stone. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes narrowed in a rare display of irritation. He scowled, shaking his head. Aviana dropped to her knees behind a neighboring boulder, racking the lever of the Winchester. "You said I had to earn my keep," she whispered fiercely, her chest heaving. "I'm not sitting in the dark while you die for my debt." Gerard stared at her for a long moment. The irritation faded, replaced by something entirely different. Respect. He turned back to his sights, adjusting the rear leaf to account for the downward angle. Below them, the sound of iron horseshoes striking stone echoed up the canyon walls. The riders rounded the bend, entering the Devil's Throat in single file. Hatcher was in the lead now, his horse nervously sidestepping the steep drop-off. Walsh rode close behind him, shouting complaints about the dust. They were 70 yards away, a steep downward angle. Gerard didn't wait for a parley. He didn't issue a warning. Men like Walsh didn't respect warnings. They only respected consequence. Gerard exhaled slowly, his finger tightening on the hair trigger of the sharps. The boom was deafening, a physical shockwave that rattled the loose stones on the cliff face. A massive plume of white smoke erupted from the granite outcropping. Down in the throat of the canyon, the rock wall 3 inches to the left of Hiram Walsh's head exploded. Shrapnel and stone dust sprayed across the wealthy man's face. Walsh's horse reared up, screaming in panic. Walsh let out a high, terrified yelp, dropping his reins and clinging to the saddle horn as the animal thrashed precariously close to the edge of the ravine. Chaos erupted on the trail. The hired guns yelled their horses, dancing wildly in the narrow space. They yanked their rifles from their scabbards, scanning the cliffs above, but there was nothing to see but grey rock and the lingering cloud of black powder smoke. "Up there!" Hatcher screamed, pointing his shotgun toward the outcropping. "On the ridge!" Gerard was already in motion. He rolled backward, dropping the single-shot sharps and grabbing the Winchester. He popped up behind a different boulder, leveled the rifle, and fired 2 rapid shots. He didn't aim for the men. He aimed for the dirt directly in front of the lead horses. The heavy slugs tore into the trail, kicking up geysers of mud and stone. The lead horse panicked entirely, bucking violently and refusing to move forward. The bottleneck was entirely jammed. "Fire, shoot him!" Walsh shrieked, his pristine suit covered in rock dust, his face pale with terror. The hired guns opened up. The canyon roared with the sound of repeating rifles. Bullets smashed into the granite around Aviana, and Gerard showering them with stinging chips of stone. The sharp, terrifying crack of lead passing inches overhead made Aviana involuntarily press her face into the dirt. This wasn't a saloon brawl. This was a slaughter pit, and the noise was paralyzing. "Return fire!" A man in a brown duster yelled below, sliding off his horse to use the animal as cover. Aviana forced her head up. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the wooden stock of her rifle. She looked at Gerard. He was completely calm. He worked the lever of his Winchester with mechanical precision, firing, moving, firing again, keeping the men pinned in the narrowest part of the trail. A bullet struck the boulder inches from Aviana's face, throwing a splinter of stone that sliced a shallow cut across her cheek. The sudden sting of pain snapped her out of her paralysis. She leveled her rifle over the rock. She saw the man in the brown duster drawing a bead on Gerard's position. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed her shoulder. Down in the canyon, the man in the duster jerked backward as her bullet tore through the fleshy part of his upper arm. He dropped his rifle, cursing loudly, and scrambled back toward the rear of the pack. Gerard glanced at her. He didn't smile, but the corner of his eye crinkled. He racked his lever and fired again, blowing the hat clean off Hatcher's head. "Pull back!" Hatcher screamed, his bravado entirely shattered. "We're sitting ducks in this cut back down." Walsh didn't need to be told twice. He spurred his horse, mercilessly forcing his way backward through his own men, desperate to escape the killing zone. The hired guns, realizing they were fighting a ghost who held the high ground, quickly followed suit. They scrambled back down the trail, a chaotic mess of thrashing hooves, swearing men, and blind, panicked firing. Within 2 minutes, the canyon was empty. Only the echo of gunfire and the thick, sulphurous smell of powder remained. Aviana slumped against the boulder, her chest heaving, the Winchester slipping from her trembling fingers. She reached up, touching the warm blood trickling down her cheek. She had just shot a man. She had just gone to war against the most powerful man in the territory. Gerard stood up slowly. He brushed the rock dust from his knees. He looked down the empty trail, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He picked up the heavy sharps. He looked at Aviana, bleeding but unbroken. He reached down, offering his hand. She took it. He pulled her to her feet with effortless strength. They had won the skirmish. But as they looked down toward the valley, the heavy silence of the mountain warned them both. Walsh wouldn't come back with 7 men next time. He would come back with the whole town. Nightfall brought a heavy, suffocating stillness to Bitter Creek. The crickets went dead silent. The wind, which usually tore through the canyon with reckless abandon, died down to a breathless crawl. Aviana sat on the floor of the cabin, her back pressed against the heavy timber wall beneath the front window. The Colt revolver rested in her lap. Her hands were black with gunpowder and oil, her knuckles bruised. Across the room, the hearth fire had been smothered to coals to keep the cabin dark. Gerard stood by the reinforced door. He was a shadow among shadows, peering out through a narrow gap between the heavy iron brackets. They had won the afternoon, but the victory tasted like copper. Men like Hiram Walsh didn't retreat to lick their wounds. They retreated to buy more teeth. Down in the valley a mile below, a sprawling glow illuminated the timberline. It was a massive bonfire. Walsh had rallied the town. He was paying for whiskey, paying for bullets, and whipping the drifters into a frenzy. Hours bled away. The cold seeped through the floorboards. Then the smell hit her. It wasn't the clean, resinous scent of burning pine from a hearth. It was thick, foul, and chemical. Kerosene. Aviana scrambled to her knees, looking out the narrow slit in the window boarding. Down the ridge, halfway between the Devil's Throat and the cabin, the forest erupted. A wall of orange flame crawled up the trunks of the ancient ponderosas. They weren't coming up the trail. They were burning the mountain to flush them out. God! Aviana breathed the sound catching in her throat. The heat was already pushing up the slope, carrying a blizzard of grey ash. Gerard turned away from the door. He walked to the table and picked up a heavy canvas sack, tossing 2 extra bandoliers of ammunition over his broad shoulders. He grabbed a double-bitted felling axe, sliding the heavy hickory handle through a leather loop on his belt. Then he picked up his Winchester. He was going out there. Aviana stood up, her chest tight with a sudden suffocating panic. "You can't go out in that. The whole ridge is going up. There's a dozen men in that timber." Gerard stopped in the center of the room. He turned to face her. The orange light from the forest fire was bleeding through the gaps in the window boards, illuminating the deep scars around his pale eyes. He didn't point. He didn't use his silent, commanding gestures. He took 2 steps toward her. He reached out with a massive, calloused hand and gripped the back of her neck. The touch was incredibly firm, grounding her, pulling her out of the spiral of panic. He pressed his forehead against hers. He smelled of sweat, gun oil, and absolute resolve. He pulled back just enough to look her in the eye. His jaw tightened. The muscles in his throat worked. "Wait," he rasped. The sound was jarring. It was a voice that hadn't been used in 5 years, deep, gravelly, and rusted from disuse. It sounded like 2 stones grinding together. It was a single word, but it carried the weight of a vow. "I will come back." He let go of her, turned, lifted the heavy timber bar, and slipped out the door into the smoke-choked night. Aviana locked the door behind him. She stood alone in the dark, the fire outside casting wild, dancing shadows across the ceiling. The roar of the burning timber sounded like a freight train rushing up the canyon. 5 minutes later, the shooting started. It wasn't the organized volley of a firing line. It was frantic, panicked bursts echoing through the trees. Men screaming, the sickening crunch of an axe biting into wood or bone. Gerard was down there in the dark, and the smoke hunting them. Aviana paced the floor, her fingers white-knuckling the grip of the Colt. The cabin was heating up rapidly. Smoke began to curl beneath the door frame, stinging her eyes and burning her throat. She soaked a rag in the wash basin and tied it over her mouth and nose. Heavy boots pounded onto the porch. Aviana froze. She leveled the revolver at the heavy oak door. "Kick it in!" a voice yelled over the roar of the fire. It was Hatcher. "The freak is busy down below. Get the girl and burn the rest." 2 massive impacts struck the door in rapid succession. The heavy iron hinges groaned, tearing slightly from the timber frame. Wood splintered. They were going to break through. Aviana didn't retreat to the corner. She didn't hide behind the table. She remembered the brutal arithmetic of the valley. She remembered that she was done paying. She walked directly up to the door. A 3rd kick hit the oak, bowing the wood inward. She pressed the muzzle of the heavy .45 caliber Colt directly against the center of the door panel, right where a man's chest would be on the other side. She pulled the trigger. The gun roared in the confined space. The heavy lead slug punched completely through the thick oak board, blowing out a fist-sized exit hole on the porch side. A choked, wet gasp echoed from outside. A heavy body hit the porch floorboards with a thud. "Jesus Christ!" Hatcher screamed, his voice pitching high with terror. Aviana thumbed the hammer back, aimed a foot to the right, and fired again. The wood splintered outward. Footsteps scrambled away from the door, retreating rapidly off the porch and into the muddy yard. She waited, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Silence on the porch. But down the ridge the gunfire had stopped. The only sound was the crackle and roar of the burning pines. She didn't hear Gerard's boots. The smoke in the cabin was getting unbearable. She coughed, her eyes watering profusely. She couldn't wait in the dark anymore. If he was dead down in the timber, she wasn't going to let them burn her alive in a wooden box. She unlatched the heavy bar. She kicked the damaged door open. A dead man lay on the porch, bleeding heavily into the wood. She stepped over him. The yard was a nightmare of orange light and swirling grey ash. The fire had crested the ridge and was licking at the lower branches of the trees surrounding the clearing. Through the dense smoke near the tree line, 2 figures stood illuminated by the flames. Hiram Walsh was holding a silver-plated revolver, pointing it downward. At his feet, Gerard was on his knees. His buffalo coat was torn, dark blood staining the heavy canvas of his shirt near his ribs. He was gripping his side, his breathing shallow and ragged. His Winchester lay in the mud 5 feet away. Walsh was laughing. It was a manic, breathless sound. His bowler hat was gone, his expensive suit covered in soot and mud. "Look at you!" Walsh spat, his voice trembling with adrenaline. "You animal! You thought you could keep what belongs to me. I own this mountain. I own the valley. And I own her." Walsh thumbed the hammer of his silver revolver back. "Now you die in the dirt, and I take my property back down." Walsh. The name tore out of Aviana's throat, a raw, furious scream that cut through the roar of the fire. Walsh jerked his head up. Aviana was walking down the porch steps. She wasn't running. She wasn't trembling. She moved with a terrifying, deliberate calm, stepping into the muddy yard. The firelight caught the dark iron of the Colt in her right hand. Walsh blinked, momentarily disoriented by the sight of her. She looked nothing like the broken, starving girl who had begged for a corner in his saloon. Her face was streaked with soot and dried blood. Her eyes were hard as flint. "Abby," Walsh said, trying to recover his sneer, though his voice cracked. He kept his gun pointed at Gerard. "Put that away. Don't be stupid. Hatcher and the boys are right behind me." Hatcher ran. Aviana said, her voice dropping to a flat, lethal cadence. She kept walking forward. 50 feet. 40. "The rest are dead or burning. It's just you." Walsh's eyes darted nervously to the dark tree line. The bravado began to fracture. He was a man who relied entirely on the violence of others. Alone, he was nothing but a ledger and a suit. "You owe me $400. Walsh yelled, his voice rising in panic. "You signed the paper. The law is on my side." Aviana stopped 20 feet away. She raised the heavy Colt. She remembered Gerard's lesson. She widened her stance. She locked her elbow. She sighted down the barrel, the front post resting squarely in the center of Walsh's chest. "I paid my debt," Aviana said. Her voice was steady, carrying over the crackling timber. "I paid it in frostbite. I paid it in starvation. I paid it every time one of your men looked at me like I was meat on a hook." Gerard, clutching his bleeding side, looked up at her from the mud. His pale eyes widened slightly. "Put it down, Abby." Walsh screamed, panic fully taking over. He shifted his aim, turning the silver revolver away from Gerard and leveling it at her. He didn't have the nerve. His hand was shaking violently. Aviana didn't hesitate. She didn't flinch. She squeezed the trigger. The Colt bucked violently in her hand. The roar drowned out the fire. Walsh was thrown backward, as if kicked by a mule. The silver revolver flew from his hand into the brush. He hit the ground hard, a dark stain spreading rapidly across the front of his ruined wool suit. He didn't move again. The echo of the gunshot rolled down the canyon, swallowed by the sound of the burning timber. Aviana lowered the gun. She stood perfectly still for a long moment, watching the smoke curl from the barrel. The heavy, suffocating weight that had pressed down on her chest for 6 months, the terror of the debt, the fear of the valley, simply vanished. The ledger was burned. She shoved the hot revolver into her apron belt and ran. She dropped to her knees in the mud beside Gerard. His breathing was labored, his face pale under the soot. She pressed her hands over the wound in his side, feeling the warm, sticky blood soaking through his shirt. "Hold on," she ordered, her voice cracking for the first time. "Look at me. Don't close your eyes." Gerard looked at her. He grimaced, a short, harsh breath escaping his teeth. He reached up his massive, bloodied hand, wrapping around her wrist. He didn't pull away. He squeezed it gently. He nodded. "I've got you," she whispered, tears cutting clean tracks through the soot on her face. She hooked her arm under his shoulder, straining with every ounce of strength she possessed. "Up. Come on. We're going inside." Together they staggered up from the mud. Gerard leaned heavily against her, his weight staggering, but he kept his feet moving. They stumbled across the yard and up the splintered porch steps, leaving the dead men to the mountain. Inside the cabin, the smoke was thick, but the fire outside was beginning to wane. The wind had shifted, blowing the flames back down the ridge toward the valley, away from the granite cliff. The mountain had protected them. Aviana got Gerard to the cot. She cut away his shirt. The bullet had passed clean through the heavy muscle of his flank, missing the organs. It was a brutal wound, but not a fatal one. She boiled water. She cleaned the wound with whiskey, ignoring his sharp, suppressed groans. She stitched the torn flesh with heavy black thread, her hands steady, guided by the same survival instinct that had kept her climbing the switchback in the snow 6 months ago. When she finished wrapping his ribs in clean white linen, the sun was beginning to break over the eastern ridge. The cabin smelled of blood, burnt powder, and roasted coffee. The fire outside had died down to a smouldering grey ruin, leaving the air heavy with ash. Aviana sat in the rocking chair by the hearth. She was exhausted down to the marrow of her bones. She looked at the door, splintered and broken, the morning light pouring through the bullet holes. She would need to